Welcome back, Valiant Warriors. Welcome back, Valiant Warriors, to episode 22 of Valiant Watch. We're about to go deep into some classic roots, the book that essentially started it all, Solar Man of the Atom. Prepare yourselves to get schooled on some Valiant knowledge.
There it is. I'm ready to get schooled, that's for sure.
Oh man, okay, so where do we even start? Okay, well, obviously let's start with Solar number 1.
Yeah.
We have Jim Shooter, just Barry Windsor Smith, like just so much talent on this book. And it's such a crazy premise that they just took like the more classic sci-fi, weird vibe that the Gold Key era had, and then just ran with it and made it into this like cool, like, not, I don't want to say deconstructionist because that's usually got like a negative connotation to it, but this really raw examination of like man and Superman and even like God to an extent. There's just some really deep themes going on. I know for you this was like really getting into it for the first time. So what was like your first reaction to the first time?
It was actually really great that you described it as like arguably a more interesting Dr. Manhattan story. And it was kind of the perfect setup for it because it's a great example of what this story dives into. It's super meta. It does deal with like a godlike ability and kind of what that means. It's a lot deeper than I thought it would be. And there's some wacky elements into it. We're going to get to the punching a baby thing in a little bit, but it's way better than I thought it would be, really. And I was super excited. And really, though, Jim Shooter did some cool stuff with this story and took it in turns. Like every issue, I was like, this is what we're doing now. Like, okay, but I'm in for it like every time. So I was excited to go through it.
Yeah. One of the things that really stands up, and that I always point to the story is that it's one of the few examples of like alternate history, time travel shenanigans done right. Because there's all those different parts where it kind of like zooms back and forth to like Frank Selesky kind of screwing up the first time he got his powers, and then going back to like, his heroic manifestation, Solar, just kind of dealing, with a potential fallout of his just very existence, and trying to do the best he can to just really be the hero that Selesky remembered him as from the comic books. And that was a really cool meta thing too, is that they actually used like the older comic books as the premise for where Solar even gets his look and his powers and all that stuff from. I thought that was just a really cool, throwback and just really skillfully done, because there's nothing in it that, like, you can see some of the influences, like that, how deeper a lot of the narratives were, and say something like The Watchmen or like The Killing Joke, or like not to hit all the cliches, but like the late 80s, early 90s. That's for the more serious writers, that's kind of the vibe that they were going for. Like, say like something like Swamp Thing. And I think this one Solar stands up like right alongside of him. Like you said, I always, the simplest way I always put it is like you said, Dr. Manhattan, but with like a personality. He's I love Dr. Manhattan, don't get me wrong. I do like Dr. Manhattan. I love The Watchmen. No shade to Alan Moore. Okay. But when you're dealing with that kind of, OP, I can do anything kind of trope of a character, I think Solar is essentially like the perfect example of how to do that well.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think it's a great example of a book that you pick up from the early 90s and you're like, wow, this was going on, because it's quality stuff. And really the meta part about it, where Selesky kind of dreams up this comic book interpretation of what this character should be, is probably my favorite part. That was the twist early on. That's like, okay, no, I'm hooked for this. Like, I got to see where this is going next.
Yeah. And that's one thing I really liked, because I like that they made, even though they're the same guy, Solar and Selesky are at odds with each other, because they're two, they're like the yin and yang. And I like it because what they just do with Selesky, like when, like, say, like his internal dialogue, right, when him and Solar are fighting in the first couple of issues, it's very grounded. You know, there's like at one point where they're fighting in Antarctica, and then they go back to like a populated area, and he's like, "How do I get this guy off my back?" And he's like, "Okay, I got to think like a comic book character." So he just grabs like some chick in a bank, and tries to like take her hostage, like Snidely Whips, Whitley, what's his name, Snidely Whiplash style, But and then at the same time, like while he's holding her and it's working, Solar's backing off. He's like, "What am I even doing right now? Like, this is how normal. This is how real people act. They just like split." And I just thought that was so cool that they'd made him, even though they have the same powers, like this more grounded version of like what a real person would struggle with, having that level of limitless potential, essentially. Whereas you get Solar, who's dealing with the concept of like maybe not even being real, but still being this like idealized version of humanity, like the best Superman stories in a way, kind of condensed into a character who still feels human, even though he's like really the furthest thing from in a lot of ways. And I just thought that was just really cool, and it's just really artfully done. It's not condescending, and it's not like, a lot of like intellectual books kind of get a little snarky and everything, but everything about it just feels very genuine, like it was written with real care and like real contemplation for the consequences of all of their actions. And just everything about it, like the explosion that causes Solar to be created, that gives Frank Selesky his powers, how it affects his friends and what little family he has left, and his work. And even that, like, that was something I thought was really awesome about it, is just like his therapist friend John, Gale, his Lois Lane, so to speak. Like, they're written so three-dimensionally, like they feel like real people. Their reactions are like real people. They're not just plot devices to move the story along. And when you're talking about 90s comic books, I mean, let's be real, there's a lot of gems out there. Starman, literally everything from Valiant. But when you look at the bigger landscape, you weren't getting that level of storytelling. There was a lot of spikes and pouches and bullets and explosions for no reason. So it just really stood out from the pack in all the best ways.
Yeah, definitely. It almost has a psychedelic feel in the artwork pretty early on, in how they're trying to convey that power of like a nuclear factory going down and how it empowers Selesky. And that's where you get a lot of the cool visual elements. But like you said, it's a lot of the character work that really had me interested. Tammy and her son, and how they interact with Solar, actually, as he's trying to like navigate whether he's actually real, or like what reality means to him as a comic book interpretation. That was some of the best moments in the issues, was like those kind of character heartfelt moments, and him like not really understanding what's going on. But Tammy had some issues in being like this submissive housewife, had a pretty abusive husband, I think, or partner otherwise, and then like has this fling going on with Solar where she's kind of like throwing herself at him, and he's like, "I'm trying to deal with reality," having this existential crisis, and he just can't like give attention to it. But all of this is happening while you have Selesky, who is like the character we're introduced as, who is being portrayed as the villain at this point, because Solar is still in this comic book mentality of saying like, I'm the hero of this story, and like this is a villain who's trying to fight me every time I see him.
Yeah, and the Tammy thing, I'm glad you brought that up, because that moment where like her husband's like a trucker, so he's gone all the time, and finally like they're not boyfriend, whatever. But yeah, I think it was her boyfriend, and he like shows up, and he's like, "Oh, okay, well, a guy goes to work, and then I've been gone for a little bit," and it's like you almost feel bad for him, because for like a split second you forget that he's a total jerk, and like he just treats her like crap. So it's like, yeah, it makes sense that when you have this dude who's like shredded and can fly, is being nice to her and comforting and everything, or at least to the extent he can be, that she would get swept up in this, I'm Lois Lane, I'm Margot Lane kind of fantasy with this big mysterious character. You know, and it's those little moments like that that it's just like it really hammers home the level
Yeah.
of grounded realism that doesn't detract from the more extreme elements of the book. You know, you're
Yeah.
dealing with stuff like Selesky when he first got the powers, causing like this massive meltdown and like killing like the whole town of Muskegee. You know, and that's some heavy stuff, man. Like, could you
Yeah.
know what I'm saying? We're used to like, oh, like Uncle Ben got shot, so now Peter Spider-Man, but like he didn't not stop a bank robber and an entire town died.
Yeah.
You know, in a Chernobyl level
Yeah.
event. You know,
Like
so him and
it's
then
almost like,
Soldier.
yeah, it's how the series works so well, because it's able to do stuff like that with the character work where you actually care about them. So when the whole town goes down, you're like, oh, like this is real and it's going to have consequences. And you're not wrong when you guess that early on. Like, we're not done with this by a long shot. You get 10 issues exploring just the origins basically. And I think it was interesting. I guess when they printed, they did in the middle of each issue, they do like part 1 of the origin and they would do a flashback, but they also have an issue 0 that kind of collects all of them. And
Yeah.
they did the one huge panel. It's before my time, so I'm getting it digitally pretty much, So I want to assemble the largest panel that they keep talking about and see what it looks like for real. But it was just super exciting and pretty heavy stuff there at the beginning.
Yeah, and one of the things that I liked about it too is when they start adding in the more fantastic elements. Like, for example, I think it's in, I want to say issue 7 or 8, when he really comes to blows with Toyo Harada. And Toyo
Mhm.
Harada, like if you've never read, like Classic Harbinger or anything, he's not changed very much as far as his
Yeah.
characterization from Classic Valiant to current Valiant, which, I mean, why mess with, if it ain't broke, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And what I really liked about the one issue in particular where he goes to Asia and Harada's there trying to shut down a Psyot who's basically like, like Heidi Fleiss, and
Mhm.
pimping girls in Vietnam or whatever. And he's like, yeah, you got power. I'm going to shut you down. You're a threat. And then Solar kind of gets wind of the same thing. So then he shows up, and there's that weird moment where like Toyo couldn't overpower Madam. I can't remember her name now. That I should have wrote that down. He couldn't overpower her because of her power, her powers of hypnosis and whatnot. So
Yeah.
then Solar gets involved, and he almost starts falling into the same spider's web. And Toyo's like, he reaches out to him. And then after the fact, like, after she's been taken care of, Solar's like, well, why did you help me? And he's like, because I read her mind and, I already know what a jumble yours is. And at that moment, I decided you were the lesser evil, but
Mhm.
me and you are going to have it out. He's like, it doesn't have to be today, but it's going to happen, and I loved that, like that Mexican standoff where they're both just standing there like, yeah, that's what's up.
Yeah.
Like one of these days, one of the two of us isn't going to leave the room. But,
Yeah.
they just been through this crazy psychic ordeal. So they decide that today isn't the day to settle that. And I just thought that was such a cool thing because to even have a character like Toyo Harada begrudgingly give you equal respect is nuts.
Yeah.
He doesn't do that. Even now he doesn't really, even with like Peter Stanchek, in the more recent Valiant
Right.
Entertainment stuff, like they're frenemies, but he still kind of looks at Peter as a kid, even though they're both just like above everybody, all the other Psyops as far as power and whatnot. So to see him and this unknown quantity that he's basically afraid of, he won't tell him to his face, but you see like in a couple of the later issues, no, yeah, it is a couple in the later issues where he gives like his full origin story after he's got his butt kicked in the plane.
Mhm.
And what was that dude's name? The the recluse that took him into his cabin. It's like Dundee or something like that. I can't. Oh, I'm the worst. Sorry, guys. Next time I'll remember to bring my notes. I have them somewhere, but I just whatever. Anyway, so like when he relays like his origin and how he got his butt kicked, and he's like, I couldn't
Mhm.
believe that this dude's power was sufficient to stop me. Like he'd never felt defeat before. And then one of the guy in the cabin, he told him, he's like, yeah, that's what you're feeling right now. He's like, you never you've never come up short in your life. And now that's what this feeling that you have is that you can't cope with the fact that there's something out there that you can't just smash like a bug, you know? And
Yeah.
so even when they're making like they're just adding all these layers on Solar, they're building up the Valiant universe around him as well, in just the most spectacular ways.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the bigger things. And I mean, early on, Valiant Classic still handling that connected universe so well, really, because it's exciting when you get to the panel where he's kind of walking up to the Harbinger building and you're like, ah, like who are we going to see? And then it's immediately Toro Harada, like just super cool, you know, just they go right for it. And it's not a few issues later that you get it's like the first strike arc where
Mhm.
they bring in the Exo-Armor. And that was something that I had no idea was coming. And they just kind of keep falling through with those punches. It's just super exciting.
Yeah, the introduction of the Exo-Armor is one of the things I thought was fantastic, just because it shows that it really puts some weight to the armor itself, like what it
Yeah.
represents outside of just being Exo Man of War and he's awesome and this, that, because like the Vine soldier that's in it, he's fully aware that he's basically trying to tackle somebody with like this insurmountable level of power, and like has a he's almost in awe of Solar, you know,
Yeah.
but at the same time, he's like, be that as it may, I still got to take you down because your goals don't align with ours, you
Yeah.
know? And so like, and he almost does, like, that's one of the cool things too, is that they don't limit Solar, but they kind of make it more realistic on him being able to do all these crazy things, because it's like, well, everything is energy. I just need
Mm-hmm.
a sufficient amount of it to do whatever it is that I want to do,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So like when he's fighting against the Exo-Armor and like Exo's getting some serious licks in, it doesn't feel like, okay, no shade thrown. There's no shade. But it doesn't feel like, say, when you see like Martian Manhunter get his butt kicked, but like
Mm.
a couple issues before that, Superman's like, John's the most powerful metahuman on Earth. And it's like, well, then how come like he just got slapped around by Plastic Man? You know, not no shade Plastic Man. Plastic Man's my favorite Justice League. But you know what I'm saying? Like that, there's that
Yeah.
level. They managed to cut the head of the snake off before that even becomes an issue, because you can't have this
Yeah.
dude like, you know, hopping dimensions and traveling through time and all this crazy stuff, and
Yeah.
then out of nowhere, like, you know, a dude in a suit just beats the crap out of him, and you're like, wait, what? How did that even work? Like that's what that does not
Yeah.
go together, you know? But
It's like the biggest thing that they do in that fight is they set up Solar, who you have come to believe at this point is kind of all powerful. And you're like, you know, what can stop this guy? Even coming up against the Vine, he kind of walks through everything because he's like, don't worry, I'm so strong now. Like, I'll just save you all. And like, here's this big, awesome, like, island that basically that you're at with all these fruits, eat up, and like, the women can like clean up, and then the men will gather fruit to eat. And he's like playing this leader role because we've got it in our minds that he's pretty much unstoppable. And the Exo Armor happens, and you get a lot of the internal dialogue of Solar where he's like, I'm not a warrior. I haven't done this time and time again. So I'm not a trained or experienced fighter by any means. And that works against him in this fight. And it kind of sets up the Exo-Armor to be like, well, if this is like this strong with a Vine warrior, like what's it going to be like, you know, with Eric? And that's what the cool part is, because it's kind of like a foreshadowing moment, because you're like, oh, it's so strong right now and it's only going to get better.
Exactly. And one of the things that I liked about that part in particular is it goes to show, like you said, that Solar, for all of his power, is still self-aware. You
Mm,
know,
yeah.
when you're a dude who's it's almost like the whole like Superman versus Goku argument kind of thing, where they're both like crazy tiers of power, but like Goku's like this incredibly skilled martial artist, so you'd probably win, blah blah blah. I don't want to start that whole thing because they never end.
Oh, here.
But you get like where it matters, you know, like everything. One of the coolest things about Valiant that's always been consistent is, and I think Dan Abnett said it best when he was on, that when
Mhm.
you have a guy get thrown through a window in a Marvel comic or a DC comic, like that's not that big of a deal. Whereas with a Valiant book, that's going to be a huge issue. Like if you're all scarred up and cut up and you got a broken arm, well, when you show up in another book, like 2 issues later, you're still going to have a broken arm,
Yeah.
unless a sufficient amount of time's passed.
Yeah.
So when you see Solar kind of get his butt kicked by just one of the Vine foot soldiers, now imagine what it's going to be like when he goes up against Arik. And this dude, he's a battle hardened dude. Like, he's old school. Like, you want to kill a guy, you got to do it with your hands. Like, there ain't no guns. You might get lucky with the bow and arrow, but he's like up close and personal for his entire life. So there's that plus the Exo-Armor. And with Solar being in this position where he feels almost like the world police, like, at some point they're going to butt heads, and it's such a cool thing, because when you're reading it, you're just like, okay, even if you've never seen, if you didn't know anything about Exo-Manowar, the way they leave it, the armor is going to be back. But if you've never read, say, like, you're aware of like current Exo, or like it's just been a long time since you've read Exo, or you just never seen any other interaction, you never read Unity Saga, like, it just gets you fired up, because you're like, I know who Eric is, and I know what he can do in that armor. So when the two of them just clash, it's gonna be great,
Yeah. That's kind of the vibe I had that whole fight, because it's like a couple issues long. It's a good reference with Dragon Ball Z, because it almost gives you that feeling. I think it's like issue 8 or 9, pretty early on, where it's almost like a whole issue of just them fighting, and it gets kind of wild, because they like land on a different surface and they're going at it, and Solar's almost out of energy, and he's trying to like make a last move or last ditch effort to beat him, and it gets dramatic, because the Vine, I guess, colony or culture ends up using their hostages in a terrible way, and there's like a consequence to his actions that he really hasn't felt before, because he's been able to just do whatever pretty much. And it was the Vines that kind of like put his power into perspective after you get a good few arcs building him up.
Yeah, and one thing that I like about that in particular, where he's put in a situation where he's got to make some tough calls, is those are the moments that, even for a guy like Solar, he's going through like this existential crisis on if I'm real, if I'm not real, like, am I something more than human because of all these things that I can do? Like, it's a very good examination. Like, we see, it's very common to see stories that have the man and Superman comparison, or like Superman and like God, or like man and God. But with like Solar, you get all three, to where he comes to this realization that he isn't all powerful, that he is not actually a god, or of any kind. He's just a dude that was in a freak accident, and now he's just capable of doing some crazy things. And him coming to terms with the fact that there's going to be times where, because of what he's capable of and what that responsibility puts on his shoulders, he's just going to have to do stuff where it's like, well, I guess I'm not going to sleep tonight, but it's like, when you look at a situation like that, or you look at a character like that, or you look at this whole setup, I mean, it's inevitable those situations arise. And on top of which, it's so organically sewn in that it just, it's not for shock value. When the Vine puts him in a situation where he's like, we're going to just kill all these hostages unless you surrender and we can destroy you. He's like, okay, well, then I'm just going to destroy everything. Like, those people are doomed anyway. So it's all gone, and that's like, he instantly, the coolest part about that is, like, right after that happens, he's like, then, okay, if this is what I have to be, then I'm going to kill all these dudes. And it's, boom, just takes off into space. And one of the cool things I liked about like the following issues after that is, you don't right away get a sense of how long he's been at it. Like, you see him blowing up spaceships and whatnot, and then when he finally returns to Earth, they're like, dude, you've been gone for like a year and a half. Like, we thought even you were dead,
Yeah.
And that just goes to show like how intense and how serious he took what his role. Like, the dude was in space for over a year, just wiping out hostile aliens. Like, that's nuts.
Yeah, like, you think Anakin taking out the sand people were bad. Like, this dude spent some time on it, like, and it kind of emphasizes the heavy moment that when he kind of beats the Exo-Armor, or at least escapes, and things turn south, and he loses all the progress he had made with the hostages that he thought he had saved. And like you said, it kind of snaps for him, and it's where you see like this is a superhero story, but they're also diving into that 90s anti-hero feel. It was really popular at the time, and you get sort of both sides of him, and it plays into that the meta narrative that has worked so well for the character already. And I thought that was pretty cool to see them to be able to do that and make that jump and still work within the story, because it makes the character so much more interesting. Like I want him to care about things on that level, and if something that heavy does happen, he shouldn't just be like, whatever, you know, I don't really care, I'm just going to go back to Earth. Like he's driven by these passions, and that's where you get a lot of the cool character moments. And Shooter and everybody involved seems to like have tapped into that. That makes the character work on a fundamental level, kind of no matter what situation he's in.
Yeah, and one of the things that I really liked about that is that the art matches it very well too, because
Yeah.
you know, it's with a guy like Solar, who's a giant red dude with this like nuclear symbol on his chest, crazy weird visor. Like
Yeah.
it's very easy to just go into like Hokey Town, you know, and just make it just like this
Yeah.
weird,
Yeah.
like just zany for the sake of being zany kind of book. But at
Yeah.
the same time, like, you know, Barry Windsor Smith and I'm spacing on the colorist at the moment, but the way they go about it, it's like it's very fantastic. Like everything about what he's doing is very fantastic, but at the same time, everything is very grounded and real. You
Hmm.
know, like the cities look like real cities. They don't, you know, look like just a made up approximation. Like it looks like somewhere that you can literally go and hold up a book and be like, yeah, that's that building, you know. And so it's very, I mean, you know, Barry Windsor Smith's a master of his craft, so it's
Yeah.
not surprising. But at the same time, it's still like when you really sit back and enjoy and really contemplate like the level of care that goes into making all of those various elements so unique and like authentic, you know, it just adds like so much gravitas to everything that's going on in Solar.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I know Barry Windsor Smith did the first few issues, but I think someone filled in kind of pretty quickly after the first, maybe even two or three, because I think David Perlin came in and did some work, and you had Catherine Bollinger on colors. But it's I've seen a lot, like especially readers, sort of like I guess in my generation who came into a lot of comics through digital methods. When you pick up a 90s book, it has a super distinct feel, and almost anything prior to that too. I know we were just talking in the Comic Watch Slack that B came on, who's another comic watcher, shout out. That earlier books it's harder for him to get into because the artwork is kind of so distinctive and so different from what we know now. And I'm not gonna lie, like pick up issue one of Solar and that cover, it's great, but you're like, yeah, this is a 90s book. And like I can just see it by the artwork, you know, and even then it works so well with the story. I feel like it only takes a few pages to fall in love. And I don't know, it builds up Solar in a really crazy way, especially when you're reading the origins. When he's like going into the nuclear factory as it's about to explode, and they're describing sort of what he's feeling, the way Jim Shooter plays off his internal monologue with what the artwork's showing. Like he's running down the steps and his feet are burning, and he can like feel his flesh sticking to the steps, and they're like make the effects are making like this squishy sound, and he's like, oh, my boots are filling with blood now, and like it gets so descriptive and puts you into it that I was like, man, this is great. Like this is, you know, this is what I want. It's so dramatic and heavy, and I thought that they carry that through like the rest of the issue. So you get that feeling of it's not just him being reactionary to everything. And I think a lot of the artwork plays into that so well. It kind of builds it up to be, you know, better than it should have, really. Like it's some of the better artwork that works with the scripting or the text that you see in the dialogue. And you know, kudos to everybody involved on that one.
Yeah, yeah, it's very much, you know, like you said, it is very much a product of its time as far as like when you crack it open,
Yeah.
uh you know that it's like this was not from like 2015 or anything like that.
Yeah.
But 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 the cool thing about it is that like by the time you reach the end of that first issue, it's
Mhm.
like it almost it takes a life of its own in a way to where it needs to have that distinction. You know, like it needs to have that vibe that makes it completely separate from anything. Because if you go and you read like the classic Valiant stuff, um, even up to like say the later issues of like Shadow Man or Magnus or any of or like Raya and the Future Force, like they still have that very distinct. I don't want to say muted, but it's like a very particular palette they use for like their colors
Yeah.
and just the quality of paper and everything else. Like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
distinctly Valiant. You could get a you could get a Valiant book with like the cover torn off and like no ads or anything like that. And if you've ever read a Valiant book, you know for sure if you're reading another one. And like there's not a lot of mistake in it, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And but that's such a cool thing because whether I know for some people like older style art is like not particularly their cup of tea, but when it's done as well as it's done in Solar and it's got just like that its own vibe to it, it's almost like a Quentin Tarantino film or something, you know, where it's like things are just kind of weird and just paced very uniquely so that it's like whether or not you're super into that style, you can't deny that it has its place, you know, and then it has its own validity. And
Yeah.
then, you know, going forward, when they're introducing these other elements, like, say, for example, all right, well, let's get to the baby part, right?
Oh.
Because I know everybody's like, wait a minute, it's been like 20 minutes, and they're talking about punching
Yeah.
a baby.
We
So
got to get to the Godchild arc because
yeah,
that was when I immediately put the book down and messaged you. I was like, what am I reading right now?
well, and the cool thing about it is that it really explores some of the bigger consequences, not just like in space or
Yeah.
when Solar is dealing with Selesky or is Max Blackwell or you know whatever persona that he's dreamt up to have like that unique meta interpersonal that is physical
Yeah.
conflict that you know he tried to do something nice and show not even so much nice but just try to like help somebody else understand how he sees the world
Mm.
and instead created like just straight up created a monster, you know.
It's true. Like a
And it's
monster
like
baby.
it's just such a cool thing because it's funny to me like when the Godchild's first born, right? When this little nuclear baby like first pops out, he immediately realizes he's like, oh my god, this baby literally has all of my power with none of my maturity or control,
Yep.
and it's just like zipping around, stealing energy and killing people in little
Yeah.
tantrums. And it's
Yeah.
like, how did I let this happen? And
Mm.
what am I going to do here? Because this is out of control, you
Yeah.
know. And it's such a cool thing to just take something that's so potentially humorous, but then really show how extremely serious it is, you know, having
Yeah.
something with that much power that's running on pure instinct and nothing else.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's part of it's also because this happens to Gail. And Gail gets a bit of a tough go at most of the issues she's involved in. Is very idealized by Solar and is like you said, kind of the lowest lane of the series. And aside from the consequences that you can almost see between a Kryptonian and a human, you get a lot of that because Solar has this nuclear radiation issue. So you're kind of guessing what's going to happen, and that he can't just be around all these people, right? Um, but it's so much more delicate than that because even in the origins, whenever he finally is able to like nab Gale and take her into like this alternate dimension that only he's able to exist in, it gets really bad for Gale because she starts to fold in on herself because of self-esteem, and like her worst thoughts start coming in, and she doesn't have that emotional maturity to stand up to the pressure. And it's a product of its time then, and how like women are often portrayed in the series because they kind of do that. Same with Tammy, and you see that kind of repeatedly. But she gets the brutal end of the stick on this one, and you finally start to come out of it. She's working again by by the time that you're introduced to all this. Solar's back from the vine, and then the godchild happens, and she's just at work, and she like goes into the bathroom or something like that, and then just passes out because it's hitting and it's starting to like form inside of her. And I really felt bad for Gail through all of this, but there's so much more things to handle because, like you said, you've got this child who is now experiencing this power set free from any sense of maturity at all, and it's just like killing at whims. And it's kind of like a big tantrum, and it's an odd thing to watch because you're like, okay, superheroes got to come in and save the day against this like killer monstrosity baby, but how do you do it? I mean, how do you take down a baby like that? And I love that they just went for it. And that's when you get like this awesome panel of Solar punching a baby. And it's just like, man, like when you think they're not going to deliver, they deliver on that one. And it's still a lot of fun to read despite all the heavy things. Cause you're like, what is going on here? It's just crazy.
Yeah, and one of the things I liked about that too is, it would have been really easy to just go with the sight gag and then just kind of like, all right, we're done with that and let it go and it has no consequences. But at the same time, it leads, the mother and all of these, the government and what is that drunk's name? I can't remember his name right off the top of my head right now. But they all kind of come together and they're like, okay, we've been playing around with this for a long time. This dude disappeared for a while. We hoped he'd stay gone. But now we have to get serious about finding a way to get rid of Solar Man of the Atom. And it's nuts because it's almost biblical, right? Like if you ever read, like, say, like in the Old Testament, there's like a pattern that goes on, right? Like God says do something or don't do something. Children of Israel, they're like, okay. Then like 5 minutes later, they do exactly what they weren't supposed to do. They get punished for it, and it goes in this whole cycle. And it's kind of like the same thing here, where these human beings who are just like nothing compared to Solar Man of the Atom, instead of like, doing like the sensible thing and just accepting the fact that he's there and his power is essentially not challengeable by the average person. Like you got to be like a Toyo or something in order to step to him. They're really gonna just go for it and be like, we're gonna try to figure out how to kill the unkillable man. And like as you're reading it, like it's such a cool, build up, and like because it happens like so organically the way it flows through like the first 10, 12 issues. But at the same time, you're like, these are supposed to be some really smart people, and they're making some really stupid choices because angry Solar is not something that you just want to walk yourself into. Like that is not a situation that you want to just ignite. Like what if he does go rogue because you spark that keg? Like what if you are the catalyst that you're trying to avoid? But it almost like doesn't occur to him because they're like, no, it's more important that he's gone than whatever potential backlash will come from us trying to get rid of this man. And it's just such a cool, gripping, realistic take, because at the same time, like I said, with like the whole Children of Israel thing, you're like, you guys literally live next door to God. Why wouldn't you just do whatever he says? Like it's not a question of faith. Like you high-fived him before. So when it comes to like Solar, like they spend their time with him and they know what he's capable of, and they know that for the most part he's trying to be benevolent, but they're still going to kick against the pricks and try to topple something that they can't even wrap their minds around fully.
That's an interesting point, really, is it kind of defines a lot of what you see in the series. I mean, Selesky is known before Solar, before the nuclear radiation happens, before the meltdown of the planet. They say that he's in there trying to be God and understand God's secrets. And that line stuck out because that really does define what's going on here. He's there. It's like the pursuit of too much almost. And when he becomes Solar and he's trying to be with Gale, it's the pursuit of something that can't happen. And then you get the godchild who in just a few pages shows up at a mall and starts killing everybody. And like it's that sort of thing repeated, and it's all a consequence of somewhat Selesky's pursuits, and then this meta narrative on what comic book tropes are, and kind of this cyclical violence nature. And it's something that the series handles really well. Even though you're watching Solar punch a baby, it's handled in a way that doesn't just feel like that. If you were watching that on TV, you'd be laughing and being like, "What is going on here?" But in this, you're kind of weighted down by the consequences of action here, and how they continue on. So that's something that I guess it makes the series holds up so well, because here we are almost 30 years later talking about it.
Yeah, and you know, and that's the thing too, is that when you use a situation like you know, so like with Selesky trying to prevent Solar from really doing anything, or like, you know, Solar trying to erase essentially all the parts of him that make him human, you know, it's interesting because it still reflects a lot of like the base nature of man. You know, it's like,
Yeah.
All right, this might raise some eyebrows, but it's kind of like when you look at the world, like say the state of the world right now, with like the whole mask debate, right? Like no matter what side of it you're on, there's still this science and everything else says that you should wear masks and so on and so forth, and everything. And then there's the other half where they're just like, "Here's my freedom, I do what I want." And that unflexing nature, even when things are like hitting the fan, and more important should be everybody trying to figure out a way to get on the same page, is a reoccurring theme in Solar, where, you know, he's at one point, you know, they're aware that this dude spent all this time in space destroying aliens because they become aware of the fact that they exist on Earth. And they're still, instead of being like, okay, well, maybe we should wait until he gets rid of all the spider aliens, they're like, okay, well, we'll keep track of them, and then we'll eventually figure out what we're going to do about that. But in the meantime, we're still going to try to kill the one guy who's actually doing something about it. And it's like, I'm sure that makes sense to you, but from the outside looking in, that does not, that dog don't hunt, homie. Like you like let him do his thing and then come to an accord later on. You know what I'm saying? Like that would be the logical process, but that's just not the way human beings are. Even when we think we're being logical, most people aren't. It's just what seems logical to them in that moment, you know? And so it's such a cool thing to see the nature of, you know, like I said earlier, it's very, you get to see, you know, man and Superman, or man and God, or Superman and God, or man, you know, all of those tropes in comics a lot, but it's very rare that you get to see that commentary done on all three levels simultaneously all the time without it being hammer fisted in your face. Like it's just organic. It just flows from the pages as you're reading it. And as you go on and the stakes get bigger, and, you know, like Harbinger Foundations, like they're more serious about, okay, well, we're not going to go necessarily completely on the offensive because we know we can't just straight up kill this dude, but we're going to start making preparations, not just for the spider aliens, but for him. And we're going to have contingency plans in case he does go rogue. And then we're going to, you know, put the carrot out in case we can sucker him into, you know, working for us, or putting himself in a vulnerable position where we can take him out. You know, they're trying to cover all their bases. And, you know, then we might have to do a separate video for the Unity Saga. I feel like that might be a little much to dive into today, but at the same time, when it builds up into that, like that's another thing too, where it's like this huge overarching story that does so well to encapsulate all of these smaller pieces to make it something bigger than the sum of its parts. And honestly, it's like you just don't get that very often with any comic book from any publisher, let alone done so well over the course of so many issues. I mean, I've said it before and I'll say it again. You can pick up like the first, usually I cut it off around 12, but realistically, you could probably go to like 20, and that's like essentially the template for a well thought out, extremely well done. It's got action, it's got the artsy, it's just like the template for a thoughtful, well crafted comic book. There's not very many that exist that I would say are as well, not even so much obviously well executed, but also well structured comics. There's
Yeah.
like there's not really an element to any of that first 15 or so issues where you're like, yeah, I mean, this is stellar and this is stellar and this is stellar. But like the only thing I would, trying to be objective about it, the only thing that I could see maybe being something that might be objectable to somebody who's reading it today, as opposed to if you were reading it at the time, is the art is very much a product of its time. So that might not necessarily be your biggest thing if you're not like into Barry Windsor Smith or Don Perlin or like Bob Layton or any of those dudes, like when they were in their prime, so to speak. But even then, I mean, that's a pretty good problem to have for a book that's like 30 years old. You know what I'm saying? Like,
True.
it's just, yeah, not to sound like a get off my lawn old man, but they don't make them like they used to,
I mean, of course, we're biased here at Valiant Watch. Like, how could we not say that it's amazing? Because it is.
Yeah.
But I gotta ask, like, from a fan, somebody watching who's like, okay, you've sold me. I want to read Solar Man of the Atom, and they read these issues. That they get the awesome team up, the confrontation with Harada. They get the fight with Exo, and you get to see the Godchild and all of that craziness. Where do you go next after you read this Solar Man of the Atom? What's the next step in the Valiant Classic that is a natural step from this series?
I would say Magnus Robot Fighter, just
Really?
because Magnus really it's kind of a toss up between Magnus and Exo, because with Magnus you kind of get a lot of the same themes explored, except for it's a more not so much uh not so much deity, like deity ideas and so on and so forth. It's more like man versus machine and what that does as far as like how we develop and how we interact with each other and what society comes to value. It's got like I would say the original Magnus Robot Fighter has almost like a Black Mirror quality to it, but
Okay.
without like the gross edgelord parts. Like it's just like no shade, but but it's more focused on the fact that like Magnus is like this one dude who's trying to be the voice of reason in the future, where people are just like, we need robots for literally everything, and he's like, no, look, like first off, we have like entire metropolitans of people who are just extremely in poverty, and like we as just a society are just weak boned because we got no spine, because we literally count on robots to do everything. And he's not like the extreme on the other end where he's like, we got to go back to the Stone Ages. He's like, we just need to use more sense in how we build our society and show some compassion and not be so heartless and reliant on cold machines, and
Yeah.
then on the other hand, with like say Exo-Manowar, it's kind of the other side of the coin, because Arik is this dude who's a man out of time. And that trope's been tackled, but it's never been done in the way that it's done with him, because even when he first shows up, he almost like talks like a caveman, because he doesn't he doesn't know English. He's like Visigoth from 6th century
Yeah.
Europe. So yeah, he's forward in time, but he got shows up in like South America, and lives with an indigenous people there, and he's like, okay, well, this is familiar, and then tragedy strikes and so on and so forth, and it kind of just propels him along into being the idealized like 80s 90s superhero in real life. So it tackles a lot of that rising up to expectations, learning what your limitations are, learning who you are in this, in not just as a man, but as a powerful man, in just multiple ways. He has like this mega corporation that he takes over and everything. So it digs into a lot of that, the nature of humanity in these extremely bizarre and fantastic situations where there's still that level of realism. Like when you read about a guy like Magnus, or you read about somebody like Exo-Manowar, you can still see like, yeah, like if I was at a barbecue and that dude was hanging out, like I could understand, like I know what we would have a conversation about, you know what I mean? But at the
Yeah.
same time, then you completely see like, yeah, I could see him tearing like a dinosaur's head off like 2 seconds later. You know, it balances out both parts so well. So definitely, I would say, um, read some Solar, and then flip a coin between Magnus and Exo-Manowar, because you can't lose either way. And then
That's
just be
true.
prepared to get into that Unity saga, son. Because
Yeah.
I think we might need to do that. We might need to cover that in case nobody knows about it. Anybody watching this hasn't read it. And if you remember correctly, Matt did say that they're doing some kind of throwback to it.
You're back on
I'm just
that.
saying, all you need to go. If you're watching this right now and you're like, what is he talking about? I didn't see any ads for that. That wasn't confirmed. Well, reality is not absolute, and you might need to go watch the Matt Klein episode of Valiant Watch. Also, the let's see what other ones, with Dan and Dennis and Heather. So
Yes.
start yourself a playlist, kick your feet up, get some hot cocoa. I don't know where you are here. It's snowing, and some popcorn, and educate yourself on the past and also the future of Valiant.
Man, you're so right. You've been on that for like a few months now, and we've gotten all but confirmation of it. Like you've made me a believer. We've got to follow up with the Unity saga just because I need to catch up. So I need to know what's going on because this newer stuff is just crazy. It's out there. It's got a lot of people talking, and I need to know where these inspirations are coming from. So we're going to go to Unity Saga. We've got to do that. What's the bridge between where we're at now and Unity Saga? What's the reading order? What do I need to do?
All right. There's quite a few, because there's like Shadow Man is introduced in it. Turok is introduced in it. Archer and Armstrong has some tie-ins. It's essentially like Solar, the Geomancer, and the Eternal Warrior are basically like round the troops up, because the mother of Crazy Nuclear Baby is, spoiler alert, actually the big bad in it. Because if you remember, in a couple of the issues, Solar talks about how she went through the exact same event he did, but she's just not reacting to it as well.
Yeah.
Well, to say that was an understatement is huge. So going forward.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll definitely check that out. I'll shoot you over a reading order. And if you're watching this and you're like, wait, what are you talking about? Hit me up on Twitter, and I will totally send that to you as well. If you don't already, make sure you like and subscribe here on YouTube. And then also follow us at Valiant Watch on Twitter. Instagram coming soon.
That's true. That's so true. And I'm just ready for it. Like we've got to build up to that episode. It's got to happen. And I'm ready for it because we're going to have plenty of episodes coming about the new stuff that's happening at Valiant. And we're going to need to reference these episodes because I have a feeling you're onto something important here.
Right. Well, you heard it first, boys and girls. So keep your eyes peeled. Keep your subscriptions on, your notifications on, and stay valiant.